Dr. James Marshall's hands gripped the steering wheel of his well-maintained 2015 Toyota Camry as red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. At 68 years old, with gray hair neatly trimmed and wearing his favorite brown cardigan, he was returning home from his weekly counseling session at the Veterans Center. The evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as he carefully pulled over. Through decades of military service and his work as a community counselor, Dr. Marshall had learned to stay calm in tense situations. He did everything by the book, turned off the engine, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and waited patiently. The approaching footsteps grew louder, and a beam of flashlight swept across his car interior. Officer Thomas Reynolds was new to the force, just 3 years in and eager to prove himself. At 32, he carried himself with an authority that often crossed the line into aggression. His fellow officers had noticed his tendency to be particularly harsh during traffic stops in certain neighborhoods, but no one had formally addressed it. License and registration, Reynolds demanded, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. The streetlights illuminated his clean-shaven face and the tight set of his jaw. "Good evening, officer," Dr. Marshall responded calmly. "My license is in my wallet, and the registration is in the glove compartment. Would you like me to get them for you?" "Just keep your hands where I can see them," Reynolds snapped, shining the flashlight directly in Dr. Marshall's face. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Dr. Marshall felt a familiar weight in his chest, the same one he'd carried through decades of similar encounters. "I live 3 blocks from here, officer. I'm returning from the Veterans Support Center where I work as a counselor." Reynolds scoffed, his disbelief evident. "A counselor? Sure. Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why, officer? I haven't violated any traffic laws." Dr. Marshall's voice remained steady, even as his heart rate increased. "I said step out of the vehicle." Reynolds's voice rose sharply. "We've had reports of drug activity in this area." Dr. Marshall slowly opened his door, his movements deliberate and calm. His military training kicked in. Stay composed, follow commands, but remember details. As he stood, his Vietnam veteran cap became visible, along with the slight limp from an old war injury. "Hands against the car," Reynolds ordered, roughly pushing Dr. Marshall forward. The veteran's chest pressed against the cold metal of his car as Reynolds began an aggressive pat-down. Nearby, Mrs. Helen Chen, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, watched from her porch. Her trembling hands held her phone steady as she recorded the incident, her earlier evening routine of watering plants forgotten. "Officer, I have identification that proves I live in this neighborhood," Dr. Marshall said quietly. "I also have my Veterans Affairs ID and counseling center credentials." "Shut up," Reynolds growled, continuing his search. "I'll tell you when to speak." The situation escalated when Reynolds found Dr. Marshall's prescription medication, HARP pills he'd picked up from the pharmacy earlier that day. "What's this?" "Drugs, just as I suspected." "Those are prescribed medications, officer. The pharmacy label." "On your knees. Now." Mrs. Chen's recording captured everything: the unnecessary roughness, the dismissal of Dr. Marshall's explanations, the clear prescription bottle being treated as suspicious contraband. Most importantly, it captured Dr. Marshall's dignity in the face of humiliation. His steady voice, his controlled responses, his unwavering composure. The encounter lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes of baseless accusations, of ignored explanations, of a decorated veteran being treated like a criminal in front of his own neighbors. When Sergeant Maria Rodriguez finally arrived on the scene, called by a concerned neighbor, she immediately recognized Dr. Marshall from his regular community outreach programs at the police department. "Dr. Marshall." Rodriguez's voice carried surprise and growing concern. "Officer Reynolds, stand down. I know this man." As Reynolds reluctantly stepped back, Dr. Marshall slowly stood, straightening his cardigan with trembling hands. His eyes met Rodriguez's, carrying not anger but determination. In that moment, watching Reynolds retreat to his patrol car without so much as an apology, Dr. Marshall made a decision. This incident wouldn't end here, not this time. Not when he had spent decades counseling other veterans through similar traumas. Not when he had the resources and knowledge to make a real change. The video Mrs. Chen captured would be online within the hour, and by morning, The entire city would witness what had transpired on this quiet suburban street. But Dr. Marshall was already thinking. Beyond the incident itself, beyond the outrage it would spark, he was thinking about transformation, not just of one officer or one department, but of an entire system that needed to change. By sunrise the next morning, Mrs. Chen's video had spread across social media like wildfire. The footage showed up on local news stations, and Dr. Marshall's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His grandson, Marcus, a 24-year-old tech-savvy law student, sat beside him at the kitchen table, scrolling through thousands of comments and shares. "Grandpa, you're trending," Marcus said, adjusting his glasses. "People are demanding answers from the police department. Mrs. Chen's video has over 100,000 views already." Dr. Marshall sipped his morning tea, his hands steadier than they had been the night before. "This isn't about me anymore, son. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The doorbell rang. Outside, a small crowd of reporters had gathered on his well-kept lawn. But it wasn't them at the door. It was Pastor Michael Williams from the local church, along with Sarah Thompson, the head of the neighborhood association. "James, we saw the video," Pastor Williams said, his deep voice filled with concern. "The whole congregation is behind you. This has to stop." Sarah nodded, her gray hair bobbing with determination. "Half the neighborhood witnessed it. Mrs. Chen is still shaking. We've already started a petition for Officer Reynolds' immediate suspension." Inside Dr. Marshall's living room, more community leaders arrived throughout the morning. Raymond Chen, Mrs. Chen's husband and a retired civil rights attorney, brought his laptop and started drafting legal documents. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared off-duty, still in civilian clothes, carrying a thick folder of internal reports. "Dr. Marshall," Rodriguez said quietly, "there have been 3 other complaints about Reynolds in the past year, all swept under the rug, but with this video evidence." The room fell silent as the local news played footage from Police Chief Davidson's hasty press conference. The chief, sweating under the camera lights, promised a thorough investigation while defending his department's outstanding record of community service. Dr. Marshall watched the screen, remembering the young soldiers he counseled who carried invisible wounds of trauma. "We need more than just investigations and promises," he said, standing up slowly. "We need change that lasts." His phone buzzed again. This time it was Jerome Washington, a former Marine he had counseled through PTSD, now working as a civil rights activist. "Doc, I'm organizing a peaceful demonstration for tomorrow. But we want to do this your way, with dignity and purpose." By afternoon, Dr. Marshall's living room had transformed into an impromptu command center. Marcus set up a social media campaign while Raymond Chen outlined legal strategies. Pastor Williams coordinated with other religious leaders, and Sarah organized neighborhood watch groups to document any further incidents. Sergeant Rodriguez sat in a corner, torn between her loyalty to the force and her sense of justice. "The department isn't all bad," she said softly. "But we've lost our way. The training focuses too much on force, not enough on community." Dr. Marshall walked over to her, his limp more pronounced after the previous night's ordeal. "That's exactly why we need officers like you involved in this change," he said. "This isn't about destroying the police, it's about making it better." The local news vans outside had multiplied, and now national networks were calling. But inside, the focus remained clear. Maps of the city spread across tables showed patterns of similar incidents. Statistics compiled by Marcus revealed disturbing trends in traffic stops and use of force. As evening approached, Jerome arrived with more veterans, men and women Dr. Marshall had counseled over the years. They formed a protective circle around his house, their presence both peaceful and powerful. "Look at this," Marcus called out, pointing to his laptop. The video had reached millions of views. Comments poured in from across the country, many sharing similar stories. But what caught Dr. Marshall's attention were the messages from other police officers speaking out against the abuse of power they'd witnessed. Pastor Williams placed a hand on Dr. Marshall's shoulder. "You've spent your life healing others, James. Now you're healing a whole community." Dr. Marshall looked around his living room, at the unlikely alliance of veterans, activists, neighbors, and law enforcement, all united in purpose. The incident that was meant to humiliate him had instead sparked something powerful, a movement not of anger, but of transformation. "Tomorrow," he announced to the room, "we start changing the system. not with violence or hatred, but with dignity and determination. Monday morning arrived with a sense of purpose at the City Hall. Dr. Marshall walked up the stone steps, supported by Marcus on one side and Raymond Chen on the other. Behind them, a group of veterans formed a respectful line, many wearing their service caps and medals. Inside the building's marble lobby, police internal affairs investigators waited with stern faces and open notebooks. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of internal affairs, stepped forward to greet them. "Dr. Marshall," she said, extending her hand. "We've set up in the conference room, though I must say, we don't usually have an audience for these proceedings." "The audience," Raymond Chen replied, adjusting his tie, "is precisely why we're here today. No more closed doors. No more quiet settlements." The conference room was large, with windows overlooking the city square where supporters had gathered with handmade signs. Detective Martinez sat across from Dr. Marshall, her colleague Officer James Wong ready with recording equipment. "Please state your name and describe the events of Friday evening," Martinez began. Dr. Marshall's voice remained steady as he recounted every detail. Marcus, now acting as his grandfather's legal assistant, placed documents on the table one by one: the prescription bottle that had been questioned, Mrs. Chen's video footage, Dr. Marshall's counseling center ID, and his spotless driving record. "And this," Marcus said, sliding forward a thick folder, "is what concerns us most." Detective Martinez opened the folder to find detailed reports of similar incidents involving Officer Reynolds. There were statements from other veterans, elderly citizens, and minority residents who had faced similar treatment but had been too afraid to come forward alone. "We've done our homework," Raymond Chen explained. "These aren't just complaints. They show a pattern of behavior that the department has ignored for years." Outside, the crowd had grown. Through the windows, Dr. Marshall could see Pastor Williams leading a prayer circle. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had taken personal leave to support the cause, stood with other officers who had come forward with their own stories of witnessing misconduct. "There's more," Marcus said, pulling out his laptop. "Social media responses have revealed similar cases in other precincts. This isn't just about Officer Reynolds anymore." Detective Martinez's expression remained professional, but her eyes widened as she reviewed the evidence. "You understand," she said carefully, "that these investigations take time. There are procedures." "Time," Dr. Marshall interrupted gently, "is exactly what we're offering. Not just for a quick suspension or a hasty solution. We want real change." He pulled out his own folder: decades of experience working with trauma victims, training materials from veteran support programs, and a detailed proposal for reform. "This complaint isn't just about punishment," he continued. "It's about transformation. We're offering to help rebuild the relationship between police and community." Raymond Chen stepped forward with legal documents. "We're filing this complaint with multiple agencies: Internal Affairs, the Civil Rights Division, and the State Attorney General's office. But we're also offering a path forward." The meeting lasted for hours. As Detective Martinez and Officer Wong documented everything, more community members arrived with additional evidence and statements. The lobby of City Hall filled with people waiting to be heard. Dr. Marshall watched as Marcus organized the testimonies, his grandson's law school training shining through. The young man had stayed up all night preparing, fueled by both legal knowledge and personal commitment. "One last thing," Dr. Marshall said as the meeting drew to a close. He pulled out a letter signed by dozens of community leaders. "We're requesting a public hearing, not to shame or blame, but to heal, to show everyone that change is possible." Detective Martinez looked at the growing crowd outside, then back at the mountain of evidence before her. "Dr. Marshall," she said finally, "I've been doing this job for 20 years. This is the most thorough and well-organized complaint I've ever seen." As they left City Hall that afternoon, the gathered crowd parted respectfully. Dr. Marshall walked slowly down the steps, supported not just by Marcus and Raymond now, but by the strength of an entire community demanding justice with dignity. "What happens next?" someone called from the crowd. Dr. Marshall smiled, his eyes bright with determination. "Next, we build bridges. This complaint isn't the end. It's just the beginning of real change." The police department's Internal Affairs Division buzzed with unusual activity. Detective Martinez sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files, her computer screen displaying dozens of open tabs. 2 weeks had passed since Dr. Marshall filed his complaint, and what started as a single incident investigation had grown into something much larger. "You need to see this," Officer Wang said, rushing into her office with fresh printouts. "We found similar patterns in 3 other precincts. Officer Reynolds isn't an isolated case, he's a symptom." Martinez rubbed her tired eyes. She had barely slept since taking on the case, driven by a growing realization that this investigation could change everything. Her office walls were now covered with timeline charts and connection maps, showing a troubling pattern of incidents across the city. Across town, Police Chief Davidson paced in his office. The media pressure was mounting, and the mayor had been calling twice daily for updates. On his desk lay a resignation letter from Officer Reynolds. Not an admission of guilt, but an attempt to make the problem go away. "Sir," his secretary interrupted through the intercom, "Sergeant Rodriguez is here to see you." Rodriguez entered, still in civilian clothes due to her personal leave. Her face showed the strain of the past 2 weeks, but her voice was firm. "Chief, we need to talk about the training programs." Meanwhile, at the Veterans Support Center, Dr. Marshall continued his regular counseling sessions. Today's group included 3 young officers who had reached out after seeing the video, struggling with their own experiences of witnessing misconduct. "The hardest part," one officer shared, his voice shaking, "is wanting to speak up but feeling powerless. The system doesn't just hurt civilians, it hurts good cops too." Marcus burst into the room, laptop in hand. "Grandpa, breaking news. They're expanding the investigation to include training procedures and department policies." The investigation had taken on a life of its own. Detective Martinez's team discovered that Officer Reynolds had received multiple commendations for his proactive policing, a term that, under scrutiny, often meant aggressive profiling. His personnel file showed a pattern: complaints dismissed, incidents downplayed, warning signs ignored. "Look at this," Juan pointed out to Martinez, highlighting a section of the training manual. The emphasis on warrior mentality over community service. The lack of de-escalation training. It's all here in black and white. Chief Davidson called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The department's lawyers presented a stark choice: fight the investigation and risk more damaging revelations, or embrace reform and lead by example. The public hearing is scheduled for next week, one captain reported. Dr. Marshall's team has prepared a comprehensive presentation. "Sir, this isn't going away." At home that evening, Dr. Marshall received an unexpected visitor. Officer Reynolds' former partner, a veteran himself, had come forward with years of documented concerns that he'd been too afraid to report. "I should have spoken up sooner," the partner admitted, hands trembling as he handed over his notes. "But now, seeing how you're handling this, with dignity and purpose instead of anger, I know it's time." Detective Martinez worked late into the night, her investigation revealing deeper issues than anyone had expected. The problem wasn't just a few bad officers, it was a culture that needed to change. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Marshall. "Detective," he said warmly, "I heard you've been working around the clock. Remember, this isn't about finding someone to blame, it's about finding a way forward." Martinez looked at her wall of evidence, then at the framed photo of her rookie graduation. "Dr. Marshall," she replied, "what we're uncovering here, it's going to change everything. Are you ready for that?" She could hear the smile in his voice as he answered. "Change is what we've been ready for all along. The question is the department ready?" As the investigation deepened, more officers came forward, each story adding to the larger picture. What had started as one veteran's stand for dignity was becoming a movement for transformation from within the department itself. The public hearing was just days away, but the real change was already happening in offices, meeting rooms, and hearts across the city. The truth, once hidden behind badges and bureaucracy, was finally coming to light. The city council chambers were packed to capacity on the morning of the public hearing. Dr. Marshall sat at the presenter's table, his proposal for police reform spread out before him. Marcus stood nearby, preparing their digital presentation, while Raymond Chen organized speaker cards from community members. Chief Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Dr. Marshall approached the podium. The investigation had revealed more problems than anyone had expected, and now everyone waited to see what this veteran counselor would demand as punishment. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Marshall began, his voice clear and steady. I'm not here today to call for resignations or punishments. I'm here to propose a path forward. The room fell silent as he clicked to the first slide of his presentation. It wasn't a list of complaints or demands. It was a comprehensive reform program titled Building Trust Through Understanding. My years as a counselor have taught me something important, Dr. Marshall continued. Hurt people, and healing requires more than just pointing out what's wrong. It requires showing a better way. He outlined a new training program that would pair officers with community members, veterans, and mental health professionals. Sergeant Rodriguez, seated in the audience, nodded as he described how military veterans could help teach de-escalation techniques learned in combat zones. In the military, Dr. Marshall explained, we learned that the strongest warriors are those who know when not to use force. Our police officers deserve the same level of training and support. Marcus advanced to the next slide, showing statistics from cities that had implemented similar programs. The data is clear, he added. When police and communities work together, everyone becomes safer. Detective Martinez stood up next, presenting her investigation's findings not as an indictment, but as a starting point for change. We found systemic issues, she admitted, but we also found countless officers eager to serve their community better. The reform proposal included several key elements. A new training academy curriculum developed by community leaders and veteran officers. Regular mental health support for officers dealing with job stress. Community engagement programs that would bring officers into neighborhoods as partners, not just enforcers. A transparent review process for civilian complaints. Body camera footage review sessions with community members. As Dr. Marshall described each component, former skeptics in the room began nodding in agreement. Even Chief Davidson leaned forward, his expression changing from defensive to thoughtful. Officer Reynolds' actions that night were wrong, Dr. Marshall acknowledged, but they were also a wake-up call. We can use this moment to tear each other down, or we can use it to build something better. Jerome Washington, the Marine-turned-activist, spoke next about his own journey from anger to understanding. Dr. Marshall taught me that true strength isn't about domination, it's about protection and service. That's what we want our police force to embody. The proposal included a timeline for implementation, starting with a pilot program in the precinct where the incident occurred. Dr. Marshall had already secured funding commitments from local businesses and support from state police training programs. This isn't just about changing policies, he explained. It's about changing hearts and minds. And that takes time, patience, and commitment from all of us. Chief Davidson stood up, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Marshall, when this started, we expected protests and demands for punishment. Instead, you're offering us a chance to become better. On behalf of the department, I want to say, we're ready to learn. The room erupted in applause. Community members who had come ready for confrontation found themselves moved by the possibility of real change. Officers in attendance sat straighter, seeing a way to serve with both authority and compassion. As the hearing concluded, Dr. Marshall looked out at the faces in the room. Officers, activists, neighbors, and leaders, all united in purpose. The incident that could have divided the city was instead bringing it together. This is just the beginning, he told them. Real change happens one day at a time, one person at a time, but it starts with believing it's possible. Outside the chambers, reporters gathered to spread the news. A new kind of police reform was beginning, born not from conflict but from compassion, led by a veteran who chose to heal rather than hurt. 1 month after the public hearing, the community center's main hall buzzed with activity. Dr. Marshall watched as police officers and residents sat together at round tables, sharing coffee and conversations. This was the first meeting of the newly formed Community Police Partnership Program, and the energy in the room was electric. Officer Lisa Chin, a rookie who had been on the force for just 6 months, sat next to Mrs. Thompson, the neighborhood grandmother who seemed to know everyone's business. I was scared to patrol this area alone, Officer Chen admitted. Now I know half the people by name. At another table, Sergeant Rodriguez led a discussion about traffic stops. Instead of lecturing, she listened as community members shared their experiences and fears. Beside her, Jerome Washington used his military experience to demonstrate proper de-escalation techniques. In the Marines, Jerome explained, Standing to demonstrate, we learned that body language speaks louder than words. Show respect, and you'll get respect back. Dr. Marshall moved between the tables, his limp barely noticeable now. The stress of the past month had eased as he watched his vision take shape. Even Chief Davidson had shown up, not in his formal uniform, but in casual clothes, sitting and learning alongside everyone else. "Doctor," called Marcus from the door, "the media is here. They want to know if they can film some of this." Dr. Marshall shook his head with a gentle smile. "Not today. This isn't for show, it's for real change. Let people be honest without cameras watching." The afternoon session focused on mental health. Detective Martinez shared her own struggles with job-related stress, breaking down barriers between officers and civilians. A young officer who had served in Afghanistan connected with a Vietnamese veteran, their shared experiences bridging generations. "See that?" Dr. Marshall whispered to Raymond Chen. "That's how trust begins, one conversation at a time." The program wasn't just talk. Outside, community members and officers worked together in the center's garden, planting vegetables that would feed local families. Others painted a mural on the wall, showing hands of different colors joined together. Mrs. Chen, who had recorded the original incident, now taught a class on proper use of cell phones to document police interactions, with officers participating and offering their perspectives. "It's not about catching people doing wrong," she explained. "It's about everyone being accountable." Even Officer Reynolds' former partner had found a role, leading discussions about recognizing and reporting misconduct within the force. "We protect each other best," he told his fellow officers, "when we hold each other to high standards." As evening approached, Pastor Williams arrived with dinner provided by local restaurants. People who months ago might have avoided each other now shared meals and stories, finding common ground in their hopes for the community. "Dr. Marshall," Chief Davidson said, approaching with a plate of food, "I have to admit, I was skeptical. But watching officers and residents talk openly, solve problems together, this is what policing should be." The success of the program was measured in small moments. A teenager teaching an older officer how to use social media for community outreach. A retired teacher helping officers understand local history. Young parents bringing their children to meet police officers in a friendly setting. Marcus worked the room with his laptop, documenting everything for their weekly progress reports. Other cities had started calling, interested in implementing similar programs. "Grandpa," he said excitedly, "we're trending again, but this time for all the right reasons." Dr. Marshall sat down heavily, tired but content. A young officer approached, hesitant at first, then sat beside him. "Sir," the officer said, "I almost quit the force last month. All the anger, the distrust. It felt hopeless. But this feels like what I signed up for." Outside, the sun set on another successful meeting. The mural was almost complete, its bright colors showing a future where police and community worked as one. Inside, people lingered, reluctant to end the conversations that were building understanding bridge by bridge. Next week, Dr. Marshall announced as people prepared to leave, "We start the Joint Patrol Program. Officers and community members walking together, learning each other's streets, hearing each other's stories." The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind from the public hearing, but the genuine enthusiasm of people who had found hope in unexpected places. What had started as a response to injustice was becoming a model for change, one conversation at a time. 3 months into the reform program, the police department's training academy looked very different from before. The old shooting range had been partially converted into a simulation center where officers practiced de-escalation techniques. Today, Dr. Marshall watched from the observation room as new recruits went through their final evaluation. Scenario 3 called out Sergeant Rodriguez, now the head of the new training division. Mental health crisis at a local store. On the training floor, Officer Lisa Chen approached an actor playing a distressed veteran. Instead of immediately reaching for handcuffs or issuing commands, she used the techniques she'd learned from Dr. Marshall's program. "Notice her stance," Dr. Marshall pointed out to Chief Davidson, who stood beside him. "Open, non-threatening, but still maintaining awareness. That's the military training at work." The changes weren't just in training. The department's walls, once bare except for official notices, now displayed community artwork and photographs from joint police community events. The front desk, previously protected by thick glass, had been redesigned to be more welcoming. Marcus, now employed as the department's community liaison, led a group of high school students through the building. "This is where officers start their day," he explained. "But now, they start by meeting with community members to understand neighborhood needs." Detective Martinez's office had become a hub for the new accountability measures. Complaint forms were available in multiple languages, and body camera footage was regularly reviewed by a mixed panel of officers and civilians. Last month, she reported during the afternoon staff meeting, complaints dropped by 40%. But more importantly, officer-initiated community contact increased by 60%. The department's break room buzzed with different energy too. Officers who once ate lunch alone in their patrol cars now shared meals with local business owners and residents. Today's lunch meeting focused on planning the upcoming community fair. "Remember when we were scared to get out of our cars in certain neighborhoods?" One veteran officer said to his partner. "Now we know everyone by name. It's like policing the way it should have been all along." Chief Davidson walked through the halls, noting how officers' language had changed. Instead of suspects and perps, he heard community members and residents. The warrior mentality was being replaced by a guardian spirit. In the new meditation room, another of Dr. Marshall's initiatives, officers could find quiet space for reflection or speak with counselors about job stress. The old stigma around seeking help was fading. 6 officers came to me last week, the department psychologist told Dr. Marshall. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to be better for their community. Outside, the department's parking lot had been transformed into a community garden where off-duty officers worked alongside residents. Officer Chen, taking a break from training, helped an elderly man plant tomatoes. "My grandfather never trusted police in our old country," she told him. "I wish he could see this. We're not just enforcing laws, we're building community." The biggest change was in the officers themselves. Those who initially resisted the reforms now led community programs. Even those who had transferred from other departments noticed the difference. "In my old precinct," a transfer officer shared during a debriefing, "success meant arrests and citations. Here, it means knowing your community and preventing problems before they start." Dr. Marshall sat in on the afternoon roll call, where Sergeant Rodriguez briefed officers on their assignments. Instead of just crime reports, she included community events, local concerns, and success stories. "Remember," she told her officers, "every interaction is a chance to build trust. We're not just keeping the peace, we're creating it." As the day went down, Chief Davidson called Dr. Marshall into his office. On his desk lay reports from other cities requesting information about the program. "They're calling it the Marshall Model," the chief said with a smile. "Departments across the country want to learn from us. Who would have thought that one difficult traffic stop would lead to all this?" Dr. Marshall looked out the window at officers and residents leaving together, talking and laughing. The department hadn't just changed its policies, it had changed its heart. "Sometimes," he replied, "the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them." 1 year after the traffic stop that changed everything, Dr. Marshall stood at the podium in the National Police Reform Conference. The audience included police chiefs, community leaders, and government officials from across the country. Behind him, a large screen showed statistics and success stories from what had become known as the Marshall Model. "Change," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "doesn't come from hatred or fear. It comes from understanding and commitment." In the front row, Marcus sat with Sergeant Rodriguez and Chief Davidson. They had all traveled to share their story, but more importantly, to show how one community's transformation could inspire others. "Our success isn't measured just in numbers," Dr. Marshall continued, clicking through slides, "though those numbers tell an impressive story. Crime down 30%. Complaints against officers reduced by 60%. Community participation in police programs up by 200%. The real success stories came from the videos playing behind him. Officer Chen teaching local kids basketball after her shift. Detective Martinez leading a workshop for other departments on transparent investigations. The community garden at the police station now feeding 50 local families. But let me tell you about Officer Reynolds," Dr. Marshall said, causing the room to go quiet. "Last month, he contacted me. He had taken a job as a security guard in another state, and he'd been following our progress online. He asked if he could come back, not as an officer, but as a student. The audience murmured as Dr. Marshall clicked to the next slide, showing Reynolds sitting in a community meeting, learning alongside the same residents he once treated with suspicion. That's what real change looks like, Dr. Marshall explained. It's not about punishment. It's about growth. Back in their city, the changes had taken root deeply. The police academy had become a national training center for community-oriented policing. Officers from other cities came to learn the Marshall model, taking its principles back to their own communities. Mrs. Chen, whose video had started it all, now ran a citizen journalism program teaching responsible documentation of police interactions. Her students included both community members and officers, learning to see events from multiple perspectives. The program's success, Chief Davidson added, taking the podium, comes from its foundation in healing, not hatred. Dr. Marshall taught us that every crisis is an opportunity for transformation. The conference hall's screens showed more images. Joint police community patrols in neighborhoods that once feared police presence. Veterans leading workshops on stress management for officers. Former adversaries working together on community projects. Jerome Washington, now a full-time trainer for the program, demonstrated how military veterans help officers understand the difference between combat zones and community streets. We teach them that true strength isn't about domination, he explained. It's about protection and connection. Dr. Marshall watched from his seat as others shared their experiences. Marcus, now finishing law school, spoke about how the program had influenced his career choice. I used to want to fight against the system, he admitted. Now, I want to help build a better one. The day ended with a surprise announcement. The state governor had signed legislation making the Marshall Model mandatory training for all police departments in the state. Other states were following suit. Back home that evening, Dr. Marshall sat in his favorite chair, looking at photos from the past year. The image of him being roughly handled during that traffic stop was now displayed alongside pictures of community celebrations, graduation ceremonies for new officers, and children playing safely in once troubled neighborhoods. His phone buzzed with a message from Officer Chen. Just finished my first shift as a training officer. Teaching the new recruits everything you taught us. Thank you for showing us a better way. As he prepared for bed, Dr. Marshall heard patrol cars passing outside. But now, instead of tension, these sounds brought comfort. He knew those officers weren't just enforcing laws, they were protecting a community they had learned to love. Sometimes, he whispered to himself, echoing the words he'd spoken to so many others. The greatest victories come not from fighting against what's wrong, but from building what's right. The Marshall Model had become more than a program. It was a testament to the power of choosing healing over hatred, understanding over anger, and hope over fear. What began as one man's response to injustice had grown into a movement, changing not just one department or one city, but offering a path forward for communities everywhere.